speaking out against casual cruelty and saying that white supremacy actually was blasphemy against the American creed, and Barack Obama speaking in terms of unison and not demonizing the other side. It is a reminder that even in presidents that many of us saw deeply flawed on policy issues in many ways, that they still had their country's best interests first, and they still tried to figure out a way in the end to bind us all together. So the timing was important, but I must say the continued political battle over a president's phone call to a grieving widow, and what we saw from the White House and what we saw from a Democratic congresswoman just had most people that I was talking to saying, enough, enough. It's time to move on.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get more on the former president speaking out in just a moment. But first, we want to play for you most of what White House Chief of Staff, retired Marine General John Kelly, said yesterday in what was his second press room briefing in as many weeks. It was forceful and personal. It was a defense of President Donald Trump after Trump sparked the controversy himself on Monday about whether former presidents reached out to the families of fallen soldiers. The president erroneously said that former presidents did not. The president then invoked Kelly's son, who died as a Marine officer in Afghanistan in 2010 when defending his claim about his predecessors. We don't normally play such a long soundbite, but we really felt this was worth it. Take a look.
Well, thanks a lot. And it is a more serious note. So I just wanted to perhaps make more of a statement and an explanation, give more of an explanation than what amounts to be a traditional press interaction. Most Americans don't know what happens when we lose one of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, or Coast Guardsmen in combat. So let me tell you what happens. Their buddies wrap them up in whatever passes as a shroud, puts them on a helicopter as a routine, and sends them home. Their first stop along the way is when they're packed in ice, typically at the airhead, and then they're flown to usually Europe, where they're then packed in ice again and flown to Dover Air Force Base, where Dover takes care of the remains, embalms them, meticulously dresses them in their uniform with the medals that they've earned, the emblems of their service, and then puts them on another airplane linked up with a casualty officer escort that takes them home. A very, very good movie to watch if you haven't ever seen it is Taking Chance, where this is done in a movie HBO setting. Chance Phelps was killed under my command right next to me, and it's worth seeing that if you've never seen it. So that's the process. While that's happening, a casualty officer typically goes to the home very early in the morning and waits for the first lights to come on. And then he knocks on the door. Typically the mom and dad will answer, wife. And if there is a wife, this is happening in 2 different places. If the parents are divorced, 3 different places. And the casualty officer proceeds to break the heart of a family member and stays with that family until, well, for a long, long time, even after the internment. So that's what happens. Who are these young men and women? They are the best 1% this country produces. Most of you, as Americans, don't know them. Many of you don't know anyone who knows any one of them. But they are the very best this country produces. And they volunteer to protect our country when there's nothing in our country anymore that seems to suggest that selfless service to the nation is not only appropriate but required. But that's all right. Who writes letters to the families? Typically the company commander, in my case as a Marine, the company commander, battalion commander, regimental commander, division commander, Secretary of Defense, typically the service chief, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and the president typically writes a letter. typically the only phone calls the family receives are the most important phone calls they can imagine, and that is from their buddies. In my case, hours after my son was killed, his friends were calling us from Afghanistan, telling us what a great guy he was. Those are the only phone calls that really matter. And yeah, the letters count to a degree, but there's not much that really can take the edge off what a family member is going through. So some presidents have elected to call. All presidents, I believe, have elected to send letters. If you elect to call a family like this, it is about the most difficult thing you could imagine. There's no perfect way to make that phone call. When I took this job and talked to President Trump about how to do it, my first recommendation was he not do it. Because it's not the phone call that parents, family members are looking forward to. It's nice to do, in my opinion, in any event. He asked me about previous presidents, and I said, I can tell you that President Obama, who was my commander-in-chief when I was on active duty, did not call my family. That was not a criticism. That was just to simply say, I don't believe President Obama called. That's not a negative thing. I don't believe President Bush called in all cases. I don't believe any president, particularly when the casualty rates are very, very high, that presidents call. But I believe they're all right. So when I gave that explanation to our president 3 days ago, he elected to make phone calls in the case of the 4 young men who we lost in Niger at the earlier part of this month. But then he said, you know, how do you make these calls? If you're not in the family, if you've never worn the uniform, if you've never been in combat, you can't even imagine how to make that call. But I think he very bravely does make those calls. The call in question that he made yesterday, or day before yesterday now, were to 4 family members, the 4 fallen. And remember, there's a next of kin designated by the individual. If he's married, that's typically the spouse. If he's not married, that's typically the parents, unless the parents are divorced. And then he selects one of them. If he didn't get along with his parents, he'll select a sibling. But the point is, the phone call is made to the next of kin only if the next of kin agrees to take the phone call. Sometimes they don't. So a pre-call is made, the President of the United States or the Commandant of the Marine Corps or someone would like to call. Will you accept the call? And typically they all accept the call. So he called 4 people the other day and expressed his condolences in the best way that he could. And he said to me, what do I say? I said to him, sir, there's nothing you can do to lighten the burden on these families. But let me tell you what I tell them. And let me tell you what my best friend, Joe Dunford, told me, because he was my casualty officer. He said, Kel, he was doing exactly what he wanted to do when he was killed. He knew what he was getting into by joining that 1%. He knew what the possibilities were because we're at war. And when he died, in the 4 cases we're talking about, Niger, my son's case in Afghanistan, when he died, he was surrounded by the best men on this earth, his friends. That's what the president tried to say to 4 families the other day. I was stunned when I came to work yesterday morning and brokenhearted at what I saw a member of Congress doing. A member of Congress who listened in on a phone call from the President of the United States to a young wife, and in his way tried to express that opinion. He's a brave man, a fallen hero. He knew what he was getting himself into because he enlisted. There's no reason to enlist. He enlisted. And he was where he wanted to be, exactly where he wanted to be, with exactly the people he wanted to be with when his life was taken. That was the message. That was the message that was transmitted. It stuns me that a member of Congress would have listened in on that conversation. Absolutely stuns me. And I thought at least that was sacred. You know, when I was a kid growing up, a lot of things were sacred in our country. Women were sacred and looked upon with great honor. That's obviously not the case anymore, as we see from recent cases. Life, the dignity of life, was sacred. That's gone. Religion, that seems to be gone as well. Gold Star families, I think that left in the convention over the summer. But I just thought the selfless devotion that brings a man or woman to die on the battlefield, I just thought that that might be sacred. And when I listened to this woman and what she was saying and what she was doing on TV, the only thing I could do to collect my thoughts was to go and walk among the finest men and women on this earth. And you can always find them, because they're in Arlington National Cemetery. I went over there for an hour and a half, walked among the stones, some of whom I put there, because they were doing what I told them to do when they were killed.
Joe, your takeaways, that was it was stirring on so many levels.
It was stirring on so many levels, and General Kelly has come under criticism for what he said yesterday.
Yeah.
In some corners, I believe he is an honorable man, and I continue to thank God that he is serving this country, and what he has said is the most difficult job he has ever had to have, but in part because of the man he works for.
Yeah. We'll
say, though, there were, while the headlines dealt with the member of Congress, he's a smart man, General Kelly. He knew what he was saying. There were several things that were said that cut both ways, that didn't just cut towards the Congresswoman, but also cut towards the president he serves. Quote, "Nothing in this country today suggests that selfless sacrifice to the nation is still required." It's hard not to immediately think of the commander-in-chief as the example of that. There is nothing selfless about Donald Trump, nor has anyone ever suggested in 71 years of his life that there's anything selfless about him. He was careful to defend President Obama. Donald Trump criticized President Obama. General Kelly said, I am not here criticizing President Obama. Also interesting that he was talking about what the president was, quote, trying to say. That's what the president tried to say. He obviously, Donald Trump, obviously was incapable of delivering that line, perhaps because he doesn't understand what selfless service to the country means. What about the lines, Mika, that women, he said, when I was growing up, women were sacred in this country, looked upon with great honor.
Right.
That's not the case anymore. And of course, he threw in Harvey Weinstein in the last week, but we all know that Donald Trump's name hung over that press briefing room as well. And then when he talked about Gold Star families
exactly
no longer being sacred, who was the one who launched the war against a Gold Star family around the time of the convention, the cons? That was none other than Donald Trump himself.
And he mentioned religion.
Well, and you could mention religion. Donald Trump, a man who mockingly said, when asked by Anderson Cooper if he's ever asked God for forgiveness, he said, why should I ever have to ask God for forgiveness? So, Willie, there's so much to take out of this. I must say, though, also, the one thing missing, the larger-than-life omission from this statement was actually concern expressed for the Gold Star family here. Right. This was General Kelly, again, an honorable man, but he was attacking a congresswoman, defending his president, and somehow in this scrum, the very woman that we were all talking about and the families of those four military men were somehow admitted from this very long conversation yesterday.
Yeah, I think in his explanation that may have been lost. I have no doubt that General Kelly honors those 4 men who fell in Niger. It was an extraordinary moment. It was 18 minutes where our newsroom and newsrooms and homes across the country were locked in and listening in silence. General Kelly spoke with an authority and a clarity that's missing in his boss. He spoke both as a Marine Corps general who has had to make these calls to Gold Star families and as a Gold Star father who was on the receiving end of these phone calls, learning in 2010 about the death of his son Robert in Afghanistan. One point to make about Congresswoman Wilson, we've debated whether or not she should have gone public with that. We pushed her on that, in fact, when she was on the show a couple of days ago. But it should be pointed out she is a family friend, and in this case, not an opportunist who glommed onto that phone call. She was in the car, has known that family for a generation or so, so she's a family friend. I also noted that General Kelly gave the president cover when he said, when he received the phone call about his son from General Dunford, that General Dunford said, they are the 1%, they knew what they signed up for. And he made a point of using that line because that is the criticism that's been levied against President Trump for using that same line when he spoke to Maisha Johnson, the widow of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson.
Yeah, but Nikki went on to say, in so many words, I gave the president that line. That's what he was trying to say, but the implication was he was incapable of delivering the line effectively. And the thing is, Nick, it's not a hard line to deliver. I mean, it's a hard line to deliver, but when receiving that instruction, it's the logic behind it makes a lot of sense, which is, your son, know that your son was doing what he wanted to do at the time, and what makes it even more heroic is he signed up even knowing the risk. Where do we find such men? But instead it came across as a sarcastic throwaway line, according to the family.
Well, you know, Joe, it's hard to know the state of mind of the Johnson family at this point in that car when that call came. It obviously upset Sergeant Johnson's widow a lot, and it was probably a very hard call to get and a hard call to make. I think what General Kelly was trying to say is these are very hard calls to make. It's hard to get that tone right. It's often best not to do it. I thought it was fascinating, Joe. This is the first time we've actually really seen Kelly's own views of the world and of politics. He clearly has a lot of contempt for Congress and a certain amount of disdain for the press. I also noted that Kelly essentially confirmed that Sarah Huckabee Sanders was wrong when she claimed that President Trump had not said what he said. So he was also batting cleanup a little bit there for the president. It was quite a performance. It was meaningful, I think, and sincere, but you have to admit there was some politics in there and some cover for the president.
It was, Mika. It was meaningful. It was sincere. But again, there were some glaring omissions that I hope the general or others will follow up with today. But I go back to what Mark Halperin said from the very beginning, from the very start, and that is, we're getting into very dangerous territory when we start analyzing calls that presidents make to widows or family members of fallen soldiers. That perhaps that's just an area that should remain private. That's an area that we should remain safely away from.
Well, it's difficult because this started when President Trump himself delivered misinformation about President Obama and President Bush. And we have no choice but to find the facts and to point out the truth. And within all that, this all started. What I thought John Kelly did, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you're exactly right, and you said this before you went to the clip. Yes, this is a controversy that John Kelly had to go out and speak to, but it was the president that set the barn on fire.
That's correct,
and
every time.
It was the president that started this controversy. It was the president who decided and by the way, I asked Alex, these American heroes died on October the 4th. On October the 5th, The National Security Council drafted letters for the president to send. He refused to send those letters. The controversy erupted, and then he decided belatedly to give these people a call. Now, this is all getting murkier and murkier. The FBI, which this is, I don't know if this is unprecedented, but I don't remember a time where the FBI was investigating a military operation. There are a lot of questions around this, all of those questions, again, have been inflamed by Donald Trump using John Kelly's martyred son, and Donald Trump attacking Barack Obama and George W. Bush and his predecessors in throwaway lines on talk radio. We have to always keep that in perspective.
There are some questions about Chad and the travel ban and how this all came about, which we will be getting to a little bit later. But I want to get Jonathan, Noah, and Heidi in because the president did start the fire here. And I feel John Kelly thread a very careful needle here. Addressing the issue with elegance, but also addressing the President of the United States on some of the things he has said and done in the past. I don't think he's taking any time to fool around here with the truth.
Sure. John Kelly's obviously a very serious man with a deeply respected career. There have been many Trump aides through the campaign, through the White House, who have found that the best way to convey a message to the president is through the media. To suggest that they know the president is watching this, that's a way to get across something important to Donald Trump. And this is also a place, let's remember, John Kelly is emerging as sort of a singular figure in the Trump world here, where he is speaking, he is the most authoritative defender of the president. That the president put his chief of staff in this position where he can go out there, speak commandingly about this issue, speak personally about this issue. John Kelly's a very private man. He rarely speaks about the death of his son.
So hard.
And he had to do this time, and he chose to do this for the president. But I will say our reporting suggests, he certainly did, as he said yesterday, tell Donald Trump that President Obama did not call his family. He was not aware that Donald Trump was going to then make that public. Now, he still chose, of course, to make this defense yesterday. We know how angry he was at this congresswoman for what he believed was politicizing this issue. But then he himself then had to step into the breach for his boss, who also politicized this issue.
No, it was
from the beginning.
It was striking to watch General Kelly just get up there and say something in a way that President Trump couldn't say it. I mean, he just got up and clearly explained what happened, why it happened that way. And Donald Trump can't do that. He'll tweet in response to criticism he receives, but he can't get up there and explain in clear terms the way General Kelly did.
No, General Kelly is a commander. He knows how to speak to people, knows how to speak to troops in a very clear and concise fashion. It is really regrettable that this is a terrain on which we have to fight a political battle now. But I would caution Donald Trump's critics that the terms of engagement have changed. Donald Trump loses fights when the facts are undeniable. When the Washington Post went out and found out that Trump had promised a $25,000 check to somebody he didn't deliver, Trump wrote a $25,000 check. Those facts are undeniable. This is sentiment. This is values. Now we're talking about service and how men should treat women and religion and life in this country and how you should sacrifice for your country. Those are sentiments. Those are amorphous. And Donald Trump has a real tendency to win those fights in a way that I don't think his coastal critics really appreciate, that those are sentiments that are shared more broadly than I think we really give them credit for.
But Heidi, I will say that I saw a critic in Donald Trump, in General Kelly, and the words he used yesterday. May not have been a vehement critic speaking on television off the cuff, but he was very clear as to what he thought was important and how stunned he is as to the depths that we have gone in this country in terms of the level of the conversation. And there's no one who knows more than him where it all begins.
It was pretty pointed, and to the point, Mika, that I was in the newsroom when he was uttering some of these things, including, for example, his comments about how women have been treated. And at that point, it was pretty unmistakable, the parallels to the president's own conduct. But the thing that is most disturbing here is that the president, in essentially starting this wheel rolling and talking about this phone call, is really succeeded in masking the broader conversation that needs to be taking place right now, which is how this happened in the first place, and taking the focus off of these individual soldiers as well in the investigation now that John McCain and other senators are saying must take place. But at the same time, I think that General Kelly coming out there was also important just because it did remind us all, regardless of whether you had, picked a bone with it,
Right.
of what really does matter at the end of the
Yes.
day, which is these Gold Star families. And Mika, at a time in this country when many feel like this administration is starting to pound again the war drums, what is the way that we truly honor and show our respect for the lives of these soldiers is by making sure that this administration and this president is doing everything they possibly can to avoid more bloodshed and more lives lost that is disproportionately affecting this 1% that they speak about.
Yeah.
This
absolutely.
1% that, again, Mika, the general made note of, that many people in the briefing room not only knew, probably didn't know, that 1%, but may not even know somebody that knows that 1%. There is a 1% that goes out and fights these fights and makes these sacrifices for all of us. And it was, again, a very strong, powerful, moving statement. I hope we can all move on. Both sides are still in their corners, but we do have, Heidi's exactly right, we do have to keep our eye on the ball. And right now, regarding this story, it's what happened, why did it happen, why did the president refuse to send condolence letters, why did the president refuse to talk about it, why was it not until the press pushed him hard to start talking about it that he fumbled his way into a controversy that forced him to address it, and now has all of us investigating it. I do want to say one other thing, too. It is, of all the things that he said, John Kelly said yesterday, that seemed to undercut the president, he also let all of us know that the president used his words about Barack Obama. He wrenched them from their proper context and used them for political gain when John Kelly let the president know that Barack Obama didn't call his family, and that's the way it usually is, and that's probably for the best.
Yeah.
Write a letter, don't make the phone call doesn't matter. So in his own way, John Kelly was providing a steadfast defense of Barack Obama, who had been slimed by this president that John Kelly works for
Yeah.
as well.
Saying it's not the call you want to get anyway. Hearing from the buddies in the field was what he clung to.
Exactly. And he knows.
The investigation is where we'll go next. Still ahead on Morning Joe, we're learning new information about the mission that killed 4 U.S. soldiers in Niger. And there is a connection between that attack and the Trump administration's decision to add Chad to the travel ban. New information on why Chad is even on the list. We'll get a live report from the Pentagon.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.